Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It is nearly the holiday season, and so I thought to share with you how I made my piped Christmas tree cake. So this cake is going to show you plenty of techniques that you can of course apply to cakes with other themes, not just for the holidays. We've got some white chocolate ganache, which is the undercoat, some beautiful pipe details, and of course the actual cake itself is shaped. So just as I was setting up to record this tutorial, one of my memory cards decided to die on me, so I know what's going on my Christmas list this year. So this tutorial is going to be shot up close, but that means you can see all the details and I will explain everything you need to know. So to start off, I've got a ready crumb-coated 6-inch cake, and the idea is to build upwards, creating this sort of cone shape for the Christmas tree. So what I've baked is a 5-inch and a 4-inch cake. You can find the quantities of this cake in the description box. So what I'm going to do is just build upon this 6-inch cake that I already have. So I want a layer of buttercream in between the cake layers. So I'm going on with a bit of my Swiss meringue buttercream, but I'm not going to put it all the way to the edge because it's only a 5-inch cake that's going on top. But what I will do is spread it out evenly with my step palette knife, just as I would usually building up a cake. Once that's nice and smooth, I can place on the first 5-inch cake, center it as much as possible, and then go on with another layer of buttercream. Spread it out smooth and place the second layer of the 5-inch cake on top. And now I'm going to be placing on the 4-inch cakes. So I'm going to add some buttercream, but not worry that it doesn't reach the very edges because obviously the 4-inch cake is smaller. Spread it out with my palette knife and then go on with one of the 4-inch layers. Last bit of buttercream, smooth it out. And then the final 4-inch layer. So what I've done is build up the height of the cake, but gradually make it narrower. I want to make sure all these pieces are as center as possible. And then I'm going to crumb coat this like I usually would any cake, because this is what's going to make carving it that little bit easier. It will make the whole cake that bit more solid, and therefore when it comes to carving, it shouldn't move around that much. So I'm applying some extra buttercream around the edges and the top, and I'm going to start spreading that all around using my palette knife. So going down the sides of the cake and filling in the gaps, especially where the different size cake layers meet. So a nice thin layer like I usually would for a crumb coat. And then I'm even going to go around with my scraper just to scrape off the excess buttercream. If there's too much buttercream on at this stage, it's going to affect me carving it because I'm just going to carve into buttercream rather than cake. Once again, make sure all the layers are centered and clean off the top corners, and now I'm going to put this in the freezer for a good 20 minutes. The colder the cake, the easier the carving. Of course, if you don't have space in your freezer, you can always put it in the fridge until the buttercream is completely firm. So now the cake and buttercream is extremely firm, which means I can start carving it. So like I said, I want to go in a sort of cone shape for my Christmas tree. So starting at the top corners of that top layer, I've got a small sharp knife and I'm gradually cutting away. I don't want to go straight in cutting this long cone shape because I may go wrong, so I'd rather cut it gradually and build up the shape. Because I know that very top part is going to be a lot narrower, I can now cut down the sides of the shape into more of a diagonal. And then that goes on to where the 5-inch cake is. So gradually cutting downwards in a diagonal action, and I did actually swap knives here because the 6-inch cake was particularly firm because it's obviously been in the fridge for a lot longer than the others. And it helped me get cleaner lines, especially where the 6-inch cake is. Now this can take a bit of time, but I'm not going to worry about getting the shape exactly perfect because I will apply another layer of buttercream and then obviously all the decorations on top. So you can correct the shape with the buttercream. So once I've got a sort of cone shape, I can now fix it with buttercream. So I'm now going to do this second crumb coat almost, because obviously I've exposed some of the cake, so there are crumbs again. I'm applying another thin layer of buttercream all the way around the sides of the cake, all the way up, using my palette knife and my scraper, because even though this cake is shaped, it's still got straight edges. So I'm making that buttercream smooth and building on this cone shape. Now you've obviously noticed that I don't have a point at the top of this cake. It's quite difficult to get a perfect point just using cake, and so I'll show you how I do that later on. So I'm keeping the very top of the cake flat and focusing that the sides are nice and smooth and packed in with buttercream, eventually getting a crumb coat. cleaning off the top corners like I usually would on any other cake, and once again setting this in the fridge or freezer if you have space of course, until this coat of buttercream is firm. So it's advisable to make your white chocolate ganache ahead of time to allow it to set. So here is one that I've made earlier, but I'm going to show you exactly how to make it. Just like my regular white chocolate ganache, I've got some cream in a pan and I'm going to add some titanium dioxide because we all know that once you add white chocolate to cream, it turns a sort of yellowy colour. Plus, I want to add an additional colour to make it green, and I don't want this yellowy tinge to it, and so I've added the titanium dioxide to the cream now. Also, when you're using chocolate, it's advisable to use a colour suitable for chocolate. However, this is a great trick to colour your white chocolate ganache without the need of specific chocolate food colouring. If you colour the cream at this stage, because the cream is water-based, it's not going to affect your ganache. And so what I've done is added some green straight into the cream, and with the addition of the titanium dioxide, it's made this lovely pastel green colour. Now the only thing that you have to bear in mind is that you're going to be adding the white chocolate, so this exact shade won't be the shade of the chocolate ganache. So I would say actually go in with a little bit more colour than you think, because it will change once the chocolate's inside. So I'm going to leave that cream on a medium heat to get it nice and hot, because like with normal ganache, it's the heat of the cream that's going to melt the chocolate. Once the cream is nice and hot, I'm now going to add the chocolate into the cream rather than pour the cream over the chocolate. Because it's a much larger amount of white chocolate than cream, the heat of the cream won't be enough to melt the chocolate, so the heat of the saucepan will help melt the chocolate too. And I'm going to mix that until it's totally melted, until it's nice and smooth. And there we go. That's how simple the white chocolate ganache is. Now you can see that this chocolate ganache is a lot lighter than the one I had previously made, and that's probably because I didn't put enough food colouring in when I was colouring the cream. What I'm going to do is place this into a bowl and cover with cling film and leave it at room temperature to set. Setting times will obviously depend on the type of environment you're in. It's quite cold at the moment, so it will set quicker. However, I did leave the ganache overnight to get to this beautiful consistency. And what happens when the white chocolate ganache sets is that it may look a little bit grainy, and so I'm actually going to mix it and then put it on some hot water just to melt a little bit and soften it up again, which may sound scary, but something happens to ganache that once it's set and then remelted, it sets a lot quicker than that initial setting time, if that makes sense. So you can see with this ganache that I've pre-made, it's nice and solid. So just 10 seconds on top of the hot water until I can see the bottom of the bowl melting, giving it a good mix until I'm happy with the consistency to work with. And this texture of ganache really resembles buttercream. It was quite incredible. And I can't wait to apply this to the cake to see how it smooths out, because obviously the ganache will set hard unlike buttercream does. And hopefully I'll be able to get a super smooth edge with it. So as I mentioned before, it was difficult to get that cone shape just using cake, and so I'm going to go on with the Rice Krispie marshmallow trick. I'm not a fan of putting these on cakes. However, if you go on with a solid chocolate cone, for example, that's going to be too heavy for the cake. So these Rice Krispie marshmallow mixes are extremely light and you can turn them into any shape you want. And so I've got some marshmallows in my saucepan that I'm going to melt down. You can do this in the microwave, which is a lot easier. And once they're melted, I can add my Rice Krispies. Now you can obviously see I'm using coloured marshmallows because that's all I had, but it's going to go under the cake so you won't see these from the outside anyway. Mix the Rice Krispies in until they're fully coated, and I'm going to leave them in the saucepan so they remain warm whilst I grab my cake from the freezer. So I'm going to scoop out all of the marshmallow Rice Krispies and I'm going to place them directly on the top of the cake and shape them, rather than shaping them before, because I want to make sure that it's the right size for the cake. It's also a lot easier if you have a bowl of water and wash your hands and make them a little bit moist before you do this, because it can get a little bit sticky. So I'm tightly packing the Rice Krispies in and gradually forming a cone shape at the top. And it naturally sticks to the buttercream because they're sticky. And once I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to start applying the ganache to the outside. Now the good thing with ganache is that you can constantly place it over a pan of hot water to loosen it up at any point. Before I place it onto the cake, I want to give it a good mix and then go on my palette knife and start applying like I would any other cake. So I'm going on with about 1/2 centimetre thick of the ganache around the outside, and it did feel quite different at first because it had more of a resistance than buttercream did, but already I can tell how smoothly it was applying to the cake. I was also aware that it was setting quickly to the cake because the cake was cold, so I did have to work fast. When I got to the top where the Rice Krispies are, I wanted to make sure that the shape blended in properly, so I did go on with a slightly thicker layer of ganache at the top. And it was a game of going around with a combination of my palette knife and side scraper to smooth out the sides. Once I had an overall layer, I ended up melting the ganache more than I would have done and got quite a loose consistency, because that's what's going to add that very smooth finish to the ganache. The ganache that's already on the cake is pretty much set, so when you apply a warmer layer, it smooths out again, so that's exactly what I did. Kept going over bits where I saw little air pockets or air bubbles, and kept layering up the ganache, especially at the top, until I was happy with the overall finish. So it really is playing around with the temperature of the ganache, the consistency of the ganache, and working with it until you're happy. But I am very pleased with how this came out. I felt I had a really smooth finish, and it was a lot easier to work with and get a smoother surface than buttercream would. I feel like I could do exactly the same with the buttercream, however it may have taken longer to smooth out, especially on a shaped cake. So once I was happy, I wanted to set this in the fridge once again, ready for the decorating. So for the decoration, I coloured some of my Swiss meringue buttercream in a couple of shades of green and also left some white, and then filled up various piping bags with different sized star tips as well as one of the plain tips too. I've always wanted to try one of these piped cakes, and so I thought it would be extra special to do this one for Christmas. Because the bottom of the cake is wider, I started off with the largest star tip. And what I'm going to do is pipe just a simple scroll border. Now this is one of the most traditional piped borders in cake decorating. It's basically repeating a scroll shape. So when you're piping a scroll, what you want to do is push the buttercream away from you and then bring it back towards you, dragging it down and letting go. So you get an almost shell shape. And if you repeat this action again and again, with all of the shells touching each other, you create this border. And the effects can look different depending on the size star tip you're using. Now when you get to the end, it could be a little bit tricky, so I kind of did a scroll backwards onto itself and tried to hide it as much as possible, but this can go at the back of the cake, or I can place some more decoration on top. I'm then going to go on with a smaller star tip and a lighter shade of green and do the exact same thing. I'm going to start where I started and ended on the previous row and do the exact same action. Only this time, because I'm using a smaller tip, the scrolls are going to be smaller and I'm going to have to pipe a lot more. All the way around the cake, trying to keep the pressure of the piping as even as possible until I reach the end of the row. And because I want to create some contrast with the base of the cake where the ganache is, I left a gap before I piped on my third row, where I used the darker green buttercream again, but this time a smaller star tip. Now what I probably should have done is trace a line around the ganache before I started piping, because as I started piping, my hand moved slightly and the line became a little bit wonky. Usually, if you were to pipe on a normal cake layer, you have the borders of the cake to guide you, but I didn't because this was a taller cake. So that was my number one mistake, but like I said, there's always a back to the cake and hopefully it won't show too much when I finished all the decorating. I went over this row with another row of white buttercream, and with this white buttercream I wanted to try a different piping technique. So rather than scrolls, I did more S shapes. So on the right hand side, I started with a small rosette anti-clockwise, then continued the piping into another rosette coming clockwise on the left hand side. So it created this sort of S shape. And piping these repeatedly next to each other, you create another style of piped border. Just to mix it up a bit and to change the style of the piping, creating yet another effect. and then again with the lighter buttercream as well. And once I had 3 rows close together, the wonky line wasn't as obvious, at least I thought so. Then I wanted to try some of these buttercream loops. So again, if I was thinking about it, I probably should have marked out exactly how many loops I wanted around the row, but I didn't think too much about it and just went for it. The hardest part is to not squash the buttercream against the cake because I want that clean line that I'm achieving from the piping tip. So going in a repeating motion, looping the buttercream downwards and upwards, until I make my way back round to where I started. And luckily I was able to fit the right amount of loops in and keep them as even length as possible. So where the joins of the loops are, I piped a white scroll, but not sideways, this time facing upwards. And again, this is a very traditional technique on one of these piped cakes. And it also hides where the loop meets. And then I went around with another piped border to tie it all in. I really wasn't thinking too much when I was piping onto this cake. I just was bearing in mind that I want there to be a contrast between the colours and different size of piping as well. So I was alternating between the scrolls, the sizes, the coloured buttercreams, and the different shapes and piping techniques as well. So as I made my way up the cake, I did trace a line around the ganache so I was staying straight as possible, which helped a lot. I piped one more row where the loops are, and a few more rows with the scrolls of buttercream until I made my way to the top of the cake. And already I was absolutely loving this effect. I'm so happy that I chose this design for my Christmas cake this year. I think it's really special. So once all the piping was done, it was time to make it a little bit more festive. So I had some pastel chocolate balls, some larger and smaller ones, which will act as my Christmas tree decorations. So I placed the larger and smaller balls all the way around the cake, strategically placing them if I had to hide any seams in the piping, and keeping them on the same rows so there was some continuity. And of course, what is a Christmas tree without a star on top? So I did cheat here and I did make this star out of fondant, which I know is a big deal because I don't usually work with fondant, but it definitely was the easiest option. And there we go, my Christmas tree cake completed. I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial. Let me know what you think in the comment box below. And don't forget to check out all my other videos for recipes and different designs. Have a wonderful Christmas and Happy New Year, and we'll see you very soon for more exciting tutorials on the way.